Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 8th in a series of programs I'm doing on the great French wisdom writer Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne has become famous for the many essays he wrote. And why is he considered to be a great wisdom writer? Well, because he stimulates our thinking about the human condition, the human experience. He stimulates our thinking about what might be true and what might be false about human nature and human life. I think it's fair to say his essays can help us to live more fulfilling lives. Before continuing with my presentation on Montaigne, I want to do something I didn't have time to do last week. Those who tuned in last week observed that it was an anniversary program. It was the 150th program we have done in the Life, Love, and Philosophy series. Well, one of the things I wanted to do, but again, time did not permit me to do it, is to thank a person who has been indispensable in putting this series of programs on television. And that is my director, technical advisor, and young friend, Jason Recevuto. Jason has directed all 150, indeed this is the 151st program in, again, the Life, Love, and Philosophy series. One of the chief causes of happiness in life, again, one of the chief causes of happiness in life is being around genuinely decent, kind people. And Jason is such a person. I've often thought to myself that perhaps I never would have undertaken to do these programs if Jason was not going to direct them. Back to Michel de Montaigne. Among his essays I've most focused on so far in this series are his essays entitled On Education, On Books, On the Art of Conversation, On Friendship, and On Solitude. Today, I'm going to focus on several essays Montaigne wrote that deal with human nature and his take on human nature. I think you will find his comments to be both interesting and thought-provoking. Montaigne was a student of human nature, and he did not have a high opinion of what we might call average human nature. Why so? Well, his reading of history and philosophy and his experiences living in 16th century France led him to a rather negative view of human nature. In his essay entitled On Cruelty, again, in his essay entitled On Cruelty, he says, and I'm quoting him, "Cruelty is the worst of all human vices." He then goes on to point out that he observed much cruelty in his own life. I've mentioned in previous programs that Montaigne lived in the 16th century, a century in which France saw a brutal civil war between Protestants and Catholics. Protestants and Catholics were often at each other's throats. Thousands died, thousands of Catholics and Protestants died in this 16th century civil war, which Montaigne lived through. Again, he mentions that he observed some extremely cruel behavior on the part of human beings. In a moment, I'll give you some specifics. Montaigne was part of the Catholic majority, but he believed that killing people because of their religion was barbaric. In one of his essays, he writes of the fear he and his family lived in, that his house could be invaded by religious fanatics at any time. Here are Montaigne's own words. I live at a time when, owing to our civil wars, we abound in incredible examples of cruelty. He continues, there is nothing to be found in ancient history more extreme than what we witness every day. He then went on to get more specific. He wrote of men taking pleasure, Frenchmen taking pleasure in torturing others, chopping off other people's limbs and killing other people. And of course, in this essay and other essays, he points out that this kind of cruelty is pretty much universal, not restricted to France or any one particular ethnic group. Montaigne gives more than a few examples of cruelty in history. And one of the examples he gives concerns ancient Rome and killing as entertainment in ancient Rome. He talks about the Roman Colosseum, which, as most of you know, is kind of the Yankee Stadium of ancient Rome. And he points out that thousands of spectators would crowd into the Colosseum to be entertained, first by animals killing other animals, and then by human beings killing other human beings, and also human beings being killed by animals. This was considered entertainment by thousands of Romans. Montaigne on human nature says this, and I'm quoting him. Nature herself, I fear, implants in men some instinct towards inhumanity. Again, nature herself, I fear, implants in men some instinct toward inhumanity. Several hundred years later, Sigmund Freud said something very similar. Freud claimed that human beings are not gentle creatures by nature. He claimed that by nature we are aggressive beings. Freud said we are innately aggressive. We came out of the womb aggressive. And Freud went on to point out that if we wish to become gentle people, that's something we must work at doing, that human beings are not naturally gentle, kind creatures. What do you think? Montaigne, in talking about other examples of cruelty in history, also alludes to the Catholic Church and its Holy Inquisition during the Middle Ages. The Church's Holy Inquisition consisted of church courts set up to ferret out heretics and punish them. And the general punishment was death. That's right, the Catholic Church condoned the killing of religious heretics. Montaigne, who believed there could be no certainty in religion, comments, and I'm quoting him, all things considered, to have a man roasted alive because of one's conjectures is to place a high value on them indeed. Again, he's alluding to the idea that some very religious people conjectured that it was God's will that religious heretics be burned alive until they died. Later, in the same essay in which he talks about the Inquisition and talks again about religion and cruelty in general, he quotes a thinker of antiquity, Livy, who said this: "Nothing has a more deceptive face than a religion in which divine will acts as a screen for crimes." Divine will acts as a screen for crimes. I think historians would tell us that most of the world's great religions, or some would prefer the adjective major, most of the world's major religions have at times condoned cruel actions with the defense being it's God's will. Among the examples I've talked about in previous programs would be slavery in the United States. I've mentioned that slavery existed in what is now the United States for approximately 200 years. And both Catholic clergy and Protestant clergy condoned slavery. Indeed, the Pope did not condemn slavery until after it had ended in the United States. The Pope did not condemn slavery until the 1880s. And Protestant ministers, the vast majority of Protestant ministers at the time slavery existed in the United States, condoned slavery. They said God approved of slavery so that people were not sinning by enslaving other people. Again, some would say, as the ancient thinker Livy did, this was an example of divine will, again, God's will, being used as a screen for cruelty, for brutality. Today, of course, one might point to the Middle East and some Islamic radicals, and they claim, or some of them claim, it's God's will that they engage in suicide bombings, even when innocent children and women will die. And indeed, we have been told that some of them really believe that after dying in a suicide bombing, they will go to heaven and have sex with 72 virgins. By the way, I do not mean to pick on radical Muslims. I think it's fair to say that today in the world, there are still people of perhaps all the major religions, certainly many of them, who still believe that it's God's will when they engage in cruel behavior. And as I said before, history shows us that most of the major religions have engaged in this kind of behavior. It is interesting to note that Montaigne's essays were put on the Catholic Church's list of forbidden books, the list known as the Index. This occurred within 100 years of Montaigne's death. So for about a century, a little more than that actually, Catholics were forbidden to read Montaigne's essays. Today, of course, Montaigne's essays are taught at the leading universities in the world, even Catholic ones, I dare say. Indeed, today in France, a predominantly Catholic country, Montaigne is regarded as a literary hero. I've mentioned in some previous programs that 14-year-olds in France are often required to read some of Montaigne's essays. One final example Montaigne gives of man's inhumanity to man. He spends a lot of time, a lot of pages actually, talking about the Spanish conquest of what is now Latin America, which of course began with Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. Montaigne talks about the brutal treatment of the Indians by the Spanish, beginning with Christopher Columbus. That's right, Columbus encouraged certain cruelties against the Indians. We know, for example, that Columbus enslaved Indians. Montaigne talks about not just Columbus, but the conquistadors who followed him in the next century, the 16th century, the one Montaigne lived in. He talks about these conquistadors torturing, enslaving, and killing Indians. Historians tell us that within about 100 years after the arrival of the Spanish, about 90% of the Indians had perished. About 90% of the Indians, again in what is now Latin America, had perished. Note, Spain was arguably the most Christian country in the world at this time. It is interesting that most school children know that 1492 was the year that Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella sponsored Columbus's voyage to the New World. What they might not know, and what I think most adults don't know, that in that same year, 1492, the Spanish government, headed by Ferdinand and Isabella, ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. The Jews had two choices. Spanish Jews had two choices: become Catholics or leave. And they were told that after they left, if they tried to come back, they would be killed. Interesting that there's a certain irony here. Jesus said, love thy neighbor as thyself. Apparently, Spanish Catholics did not believe this applied to Indians and Jews. Writer Eckhart Tolle, in writing about man's inhumanity to man, said this, and I'm quoting him, and this is pretty hard-hitting stuff. By far, the greater part of violence that human beings have inflicted on other human beings is not the work of criminals or the mentally deranged, but of normal, respectable citizens. He goes on to say, one can go so far as to say that on this planet, normal equals insane. Montaigne, in his comments on human nature, said that there is potential for great evil in all of us. Again, his own words. Every man carries in himself the complete pattern of human nature. Montaigne's comment reminds me of something a Tolstoy character said centuries later. Tolstoy had one of his characters say that it is foolish to say that a person is wise or unwise, kind or unkind, energetic or lazy. Tolstoy's character went on to say it would be more appropriate to say that someone is more often wise than unwise, more often kind than unkind, more often energetic than lazy. But the idea is that every person displays all of these characteristics at one time, that no one is always wise or always kind or always energetic. In other words, according to Tolstoy, we human beings are pretty complicated creatures. Perhaps Pascal said it best in commenting on human nature. Pascal, another very famous French intellectual and devout Catholic, by the way. He was a mathematician, world-class mathematician, and a devout Catholic. Here's what Pascal said about human nature, and I'm quoting him. There are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad. Well, what to do? What to do? How can society, how can the world get human beings to treat each other better? Montaigne claimed the key is introspection, self-examination. Montaigne said this, and I'm quoting him, I study myself more than any other subject. And he went on to point out, he studied not only what was good and positive in himself, but also what was negative and potentially evil in himself. And Montaigne went on to explain that most people, in his opinion, engage in very little introspection, very little self-examination, so that many people remain blind when it comes to understanding and even knowing themselves. Jesus, on the subject of self-awareness, said this: "Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?" How many people regularly check themselves out for the 7 deadly sins? For example, envy. Some of the great thinkers claim that envy is perhaps the most common human emotion. And isn't it true that when people envy other people, they may well attempt to hurt those people whom they envy through gossip or sarcastic comments, etc. Indeed, envy can often lead to happiness stealing, perhaps the most common kind of stealing. I wonder how many Catholics, when they go to confession, say something to this effect: "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." 3 times during the last several weeks, I've tried to steal someone's happiness. I wonder how many Christians and people of other religions even regard happiness stealing as a sin. They may conclude, well, I don't steal money from anybody, so I don't steal. Well, again, there are so many ways we can steal from other people. Another one of the 7 deadly sins that I think we should all check ourselves out about to see if we're guilty of it is sloth, laziness, doing shoddy work. Does the teacher prepare his or her lessons? Does the professor prepare his or her lectures? Does the plumber do good work? Does the electrician do good work? Is the politician serving us well? Another example of sloth, of laziness, perhaps a rather common example, trying to arrange things in the workplace so that others do more work than we do and don't get any more money for it. Indeed, I've been teaching now for almost 42 years, and at various levels in education. I've seen teachers, professors, try to arrange things so they do less work than others and even try to make more money than those other people work. I wonder if they realize they're engaging in the sin of sloth. And of course, another one of the 7 deadly sins that we should check ourselves out for is greed. And I don't need to enumerate the many forms greed takes. And of course, there is pride. Do we exaggerate our own importance? Do we think of ourselves as more moral than we are? Do we think of ourselves as more moral than we are? Montaigne said this about human nature, his own words: "Men are vain and unstable creatures." Isn't it true that many very immoral men and women are pillars of the community, occupying important positions in education, business, politics, and the law? Montaigne contended that many people secure high-status jobs not through merit, but through other means. His own words: "I find that the highest places in society are usually seized by the least capable people." He continues, "Only observe who have most power in the cities. You will generally find that they are the least talented." Some centuries later, Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, said something similar. Franklin said that when he was young, he was astonished by how many unqualified people got important positions in society. But as he grew older and less naive, he came to realize that it's not always merit that decides who gets the job. Perhaps Thomas Jefferson put it more candidly than anyone else. Jefferson was asked whether he believed what some great thinkers had said about human beings, specifically that 14 out of 15 people are rogues. Jefferson said no. Jefferson said, you will find more than one good person out of 15. He said, I'm quite confident about that. But then Jefferson went on to say this. He said, but if you are talking about people, and here are Jefferson's own words now, if you are talking about people who always contrive to nestle themselves into places of power and profit, end of quote, then maybe the proportion is not too high. Richard Hofstadter, a professor who was a Jefferson scholar, said that Jefferson distrusted, high status people more than low status people. That Jefferson believed that high status people generally do much more evil in the world than people who had a low social status. What do you think? Well, according to Montaigne, what else can be done to make people more aware of human nature, more introspective about themselves? Well, he believed education was crucial, especially requiring courses in philosophy and psychology, and teaching history in a more meaningful way. I'll have much more to say about this next week, but I see I'm running short on time. So I'd like to conclude in my usual way. Henry David Thoreau claimed that we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, he penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts. Custom, I'd like to end with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in Walden, his masterpiece, wrote the following: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.